Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Michel de Montaigne is going to end his essay to Philosophize is to learn how to die with a number of useful arguments and reflections about death and life intended to help us put them into the proper perspective and to avoid a key mistake or error that he thinks so many people are making, which is to look at life and death as simply opposites to each other rather than interconnected in important ways, and as one of them being good, that is life, and the other one being bad or evil, namely death. And he thinks that there's a lot of ideas, arguments that we can bring up for ourselves, which he's used presumably for himself to help with developing a better sense of proportion and perspective. And so the first thing that he's going to say along these lines is how absurd and actually foolishness, sotis, right? How dumb, we could say, to anguish over our passing into freedom from all anguish. And anguish there is pen, so you could translate that as being pained as well, to be bothered, to be upset. So why should we be upset about when we die, passing over into freedom from all being upset? We're not going to be upset when we're dead. Now we could be upset while we're dying, of course. And he says that he's going to give us some interesting reflections here. He tells us, just as our birth was the birth of all things for us, we come into the world, and he's not saying that our birth is when the world began, but it's when the world began for us, so our death will be the death of all of these things for us. And he says that's why it's equally mad to weep because we won't be alive 100 years from now, and to weep because we were not alive 100 years ago. So if we don't weep because we weren't born 100 years ago, we weren't alive back then, why are we worried about what's going to happen 100 years from now? They're really the same sort of thing. And he tells us death is the origin of another life. We wept like this, and it cost us just as dear when we entered into this life, stripping off our former veil as we did that. And he's going to give us a couple other really interesting reflections as well. He says, is it reasonable to fear for so long a time something which lasts so short a time, namely our dying? Living a long life or a short life are all made one by death. And he's going to suggest that our terms here, our concepts, relative terms, long and short, which we view as opposites, that they don't apply to what is no more. So your life is over. It really wasn't even a long or a short life. He says that if we compare our own span against eternity or against the span of mountains, rivers, stars, trees, saying longer or shorter becomes equally ridiculous. And then we also have this interesting reflection where he says, the same journey from death to life, which you once made without suffering or fear, make it again from life to death. So here he's also going to bring up a number of what he's going to later call nature's good counsels, putting them into the mouth of a nature who is personified and who would be talking to us, right? So the first consideration is that your death is actually part of the order of the universe. And there's two ways that we can look at this. One is that you are a mortal being, so of course you're going to die, right? Death is one of the attributes you were created with. Death is part of you. You're running away from yourself when you're trying to escape death. This being which you enjoy is equally divided between death and life, right? So nature is telling you that. And he actually goes on and says, all that you live, you have stolen from life. You live at her expense. Isn't that an interesting idea? But we're also part of sort of a cosmic order as well. He tells us that your death is part of the life of the world. And he brings up this passage, mortal creatures live lives dependent on each other like runners in a relay. They pass on the torch of life. So wouldn't it be unjust for you to expect more than your fair share of that life? He also tells us that we are in death while we are in life. When you are no more in life, you are after death. Or if you prefer it thus, after life you're dead, but during life you are dying. And death touches the dying more harshly than the dead in a more lively fashion and more essentially. So while we're dying, we can be concerned with death, but we're not going to be concerned with it when we actually are dead. So maybe if we take the perspective that what really matters is the long view, we don't have to be bothered by that. Then he's got another really interesting consideration here, a really good argument, I think. There is one objection that you could make to it, but here's the argument. If you've profited from life, you've had your fill. Go away satisfied. You've got enough, right? But if you didn't learn how to live, if life is useless to you, what the hell does it matter that you've lost it? What do you want it for? Now, you could, of course, say, well, what if I learned how to live properly? But then that doesn't completely get you out of the dilemma, because once you learn how to live properly, you would live life well and you would, again, have enough. So this is nature telling you that if you can't actually live a good life, what the hell good is another year, another minute? It's not profiting anybody. He also says something else, and this is actually coming straight from Seneca, who Montaigne, brings up quite a bit. Life itself is neither a good nor an evil. Instead, what is life? Life is where good and evil have a place. And again, this is sort of like the one that we just talked about. Good and evil have a place, he says, depending on how you make it for them. So, your life could suck, and that's going to be on you, most likely. Your life can also be good, and that also is going to be on you. But when you die, no more life, no more good, no more evil. So it's not life itself that is good or evil. And he goes on, and he's going to give us some other considerations. One that we could place under his sort of motto of equity and equality. And there's two parts to this, right? One of these is make way for others as others did for you, which, again, that part of the universe. So if people don't die, well, there's no room for new living beings. So go ahead and die and get out of the way. Marcus Aurelius actually says something like this in his Meditations. And Montaigne says the first part of equity is equality. So equity, doing what's equitable, what's fair, and then equality. Why does equality enter in here? Because we're all going to die. Because it is indeed the great equalizer. He says, who can complain of being included when all are included, right? Everybody is going to die. He goes on as well, and he gives us a number of considerations that are essentially coming from Epicureans, but also from others about what happens when we actually die. And this is nature talking, right? I shall arrange you have no unhappiness. And he quotes this line here. Do you not know that in real death there will be no second you living to lament your death and standing by your corpse? And he goes on, you will not desire the life which now you so much lament, because part of what it means to die is that there is no more you there to have any problems. And then he says something really interesting here. Death is less to be feared than nothing. So what does that mean? Is there like a hierarchy and maybe you fear nothing 50%? No, you fear nothing 0%. And death is less to be feared than nothing if there be anything less than nothing. And is there anything less than nothing? No, of course not. Death, it just simply is a kind of nothing. And he reinforces this point saying, listen, death doesn't concern you, dead or alive, because if you're alive, you're alive. If you're dead, you are no more. So these are a bunch of ideas basically taken from the Epicurean tradition. And then he's got a couple other things that he has nature saying as well. This is a really interesting one about the road. Wherever your life ends, there all of it ends. And, you are going to reach the end sooner or later. He says, do you think you'll never arrive where you're ceaselessly heading? Where are you going? Every road has its end. So the road of life is indeed death. And he adds another consideration there. You're not going to die alone, right? If it's a relief to have company, the whole world is going at the same pace as you are. Is there anything which is not growing old with you? At the same instant that you die, you don't die as the unique individual that is the only person dying. He says hundreds of men, of beasts, and other creatures are dying too. So, don't pull back from it in that case. And then he says, you also don't know what death even is, and it's simple-minded of you to condemn something which you've never experienced either yourself or through another. You don't have enough information to go on to complain about it. And then finally, the last really interesting point of view that he's going to bring up is about immortality. And he says, so he brings up this example of Chiron, who refuses immortality when told of its characteristics by his father Saturn, the god of time and duration. And then he has nature say, truly imagine how much less bearable for man and how much more painful would be a life which lasted forever rather than the life which I've given you. If you did not have death, you would curse me, nature, forever for depriving you of it. Why? Well, because life itself would grow unbearable, and he says, I actually have a strategy that I pursued here. Seeing what advantages death holds, I deliberately mixed a little pain or anguish into it to stop you from embracing it too avidly or too injudiciously, to lodge you in that moderation which I require of you, neither fleeing from life nor fleeing from death. I tempered them both between the bitter and the sweet, two ends of the spectrum as far as our tastes go. So he goes on and he says, well, these are the good counsels of nature, our mother. And then he's going to conclude by bringing up a speculation on his point. He says, I've often wondered why the face of death in ourselves or other men appears less terrifying to us in war than in our own homes. And why, since death is always the same, there's more steadfastness among village people and lower orders than there is among the rest. So here's my idea that I have about this. I believe what frightens us more than death itself are the terrifying grimaces and preparations with which we surround it. A brand new way of life, mothers, wives, and children weeping, visits from people stunned and beside themselves with grief, presence of a crowd of servants pale and tear-stained, bedchamber without daylight, candles lighted, our bedside besieged by doctors and preachers. In short, all about us is horror and terror. We are under the ground, buried in our graves already. And he says, children are frightened of their very friends when they see them masked. So are we. We should tear the masks off of things as well as people. And if we do that, what do we find? It's the same death for everybody. So if we're not afraid when we're in war, now granted, sometimes people are, but they're not usually as afraid as they are in peacetime. Or if we're wealthy and we've got a lot of people surrounding us, we're more afraid. But if we're an ordinary working person, we're not quite so scared of it. Why is that the case? Well, he says, we'll find that only the same death which a valet and a chambermaid got through recently without being afraid is the same death for us. So if we carry out these reflections, this can really help us to carry out the preparation for death that Montaigne thinks that philosophy ought to be, and we'll become familiarized with death and it won't bother us quite as much. And he's offering you like a cornucopia here. Pick whatever arguments are going to work for you, and if they help you out, well, that's great. And Montaigne presumably thinks that any one of these could in fact help us get over our fear and our errors about death.